5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
With all the problems the church is facing today, many people wonder if there aren't some easy solutions. For instance, with the number of parishes that are being closed, even dioceses that are merging, the priest shortage, couldn't we solve that by allowing priests to marry and women to become priests? And yet to both of these, the church has, for a variety of reasons, consistently said no, or not really, or not yet. But what does that mean? Why does the church teach what she teaches about priestly celibacy and the male-only priesthood? That's what we're going to be talking about today on Ignition. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Bergwald, and we want to set your faith ablaze so that you might live the adventure that comes from a relationship with Jesus Christ. Before we get into today's topic, we want you to know that we love listener feedback. So if you've got questions about this episode, this topic, or if you have ideas for future episodes, please contact us, and the easiest way to do so is by email. And the address, this is where I slow down. The address, dear listeners, is ignition@sfcatholic.org. I'm slowing down in case you're a first-time listener, because normally I talk like this and I have friends who are like, Chris, you're talking too fast. I can't remember the email address. So
I can't even understand the email address.
Again, ignition, IGNITION @SF. That's Sioux Falls, not San Francisco.
Right.
sfcatholic.org. Nothing against San Francisco.
We snagged it, though.
It's named after St. Francis, but we did get it.
Yes.
So that's the email address, folks. Please feel free to reach out again if you have ideas for future episodes, or if you have questions about today's episode. And you might, because today we're tackling one of the hotter topics, and the reason we're doing that is because my favorite co-host.
Wow. Ow.
Renae Kranz proposed it for good reason, actually. So Renae, not a numbskull, beloved regular co-host of Ignition. Would you just briefly, in case folks haven't tuned in for a while or ever, introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Renae Kranz. I'm the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Sioux Falls. Lived in Sioux Falls for 15 years now, I believe. Oh, something like that. Maybe 17.
Ish.
2005, 17. And I'm married to Ryan from Watertown area originally. Lived in several places. Yeah. Have a cat.
Okay.
Don't have any kids. It's going downhill fast.
Yeah, you got to have the clean ending here, and we're getting into
I know. I'm sorry.
So Renae, you actually, you and I were talking recently about topics for this and upcoming episodes, and this was actually it is one that you raised because you're involved in some of the feedback from our. By the way, did you notice during my standard for years now, my intro, we want to set your faith ablaze so that you may live the adventure.
I'm sure that's where we took it from.
Set your faith ablaze, and the name of our pastoral planning process, beautiful name is Set Ablaze. Set Ablaze. Surprise, surprise. How about that?
Yes, it's a good one.
Not done on purpose by anybody, I don't think.
No.
But you see some of the feedback, and folks do in our diocese specifically have been wondering or proposing, hey, if some of the changes that are being proposed as part of this planning process, it does seem that this will be alleviated if we allowed married priests or women priests. Right? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I've heard that a few times, and. Yeah, it's always a mystery to me when that pops up, to be honest.
Because?
I guess I've always thought the church was fairly clear on that.
Right.
And so it's just I'm always surprised when it pops up.
Yeah. So this topic is relevant in a real way to the planning process. People, I'm sure, in addition to the submissions that have been made that you've seen, other people are probably wondering.
Sure. Yeah.
And so you might be one of those people as you're listening to this episode. You might be wondering, why? I mean, priest shortage across the country. Even if no matter if you live in the Diocese of Sioux Falls or elsewhere, we could always use more priests. Right. And a lot of people are like, well, can't we just allow them to get married and ordain women? Wouldn't that help
Yeah. And at the very least, they've probably heard that argument from other people and might not know exactly how to counter it.
Exactly. Yeah. So what we want to do is today is whether you're somebody who asks that question or whether you're somebody going into Thanksgiving and Advent and families getting together and questions come up and maybe give a couple thoughts and certainly then point you towards some places to look for more detail. So there are two. They get oftentimes lumped together, but there really are in significant ways separate issues. The question of married priesthood, or why we have the practice of priestly celibacy, is one thing, and then the male-only priesthood, why women can't be ordained, is a separate one. Right. So, Renae, which one? I'll let you choose your own adventure here.
Choose my own adventure.
Where do you want to start, at least?
Let's start with married priests.
Okay, so the first, I am curious to know what your questions are, but while you're thinking about those, I want to get a couple things out of the way right away. So first of all, priestly celibacy is not a doctrine, it's a discipline. So it's not a doctrine. It's not a formal teaching of the church. It's a practice of the church, but it's not a teaching of the church. And that's an important distinction because all the teachings of the church ultimately come from Jesus himself. Right. And therefore are not changeable because they're not ours to change. Right. Practices or disciplines, other examples of disciplines, the language that the Mass is said in.
Fasting.
Fasting.
Has changed over the years.
Yeah. So practices are things that the church, if you will, as our mother, the image of the church as a mother, these are things that our mother, the church, asks of us to help us become holier in a variety of ways. She specifies how to live. What does it mean? Like my mom would teach us this. This is how we eat, or the manners of our family. This is what we do as Bergwalds. The church does something similar. This is what we do as Catholic Christians for good reasons, right? So fasting, language of the Mass, good reasons. But as with those things can change, and priestly celibacy is a discipline of the church that can change and can vary. So many Catholics in the United States are not aware of the fact that there are hundreds, maybe even, I'm not sure about the numbers here. There's certainly hundreds, maybe even thousands of married Catholic priests. Okay. Now, most of them are in Europe. Right. Because they're Eastern Catholics. Yes. So Eastern Catholics,
to Roman Catholics.
As opposed to Roman. So Eastern Catholics, they believe everything. They believe all the Catholic doctrines. They have all the sacraments. They have bishops. They're in union with the Pope. But the style of their liturgy, their Mass, they don't call it the Mass, they have a different name. But the way they celebrate the sacraments, the teachings are all the same and the essentials are all there, but it's a little bit different. Okay. And the Eastern practice since, at least the 8th century, not the beginning, since the 8th century, the Eastern practice has been to allow married men to be ordained as priests. Okay. So in the East, that the discipline of priestly celibacy has not been present since the 8th century. Right. In the West, even in the West, so in the West, like Europe and the United States, there are married Catholic priests. Right. Father Drake McAllister, somebody I know. We aren't buddy, but we're friendly. If we're not friends, Father Drake McAllister teaches at Franciscan University of Steubenville in Steubenville, Ohio. Father Drake and his wife converted Catholicism about 15-ish. 10, 15 years ago. He was a Protestant pastor, right, who became Catholic. And after several years of discerning, he asked his local bishop if he could pursue the possibility of ordination to the priesthood. So, as far as the church is concerned, he became Catholic. He was a layman. He was baptized, but he was his Protestant pastorhood, if you will, does not carry over. Right. But he approached his bishop as a Catholic. Hey, I feel like maybe the Lord's calling me to this, but that's a two-way street. Like, what do you think? And could we pursue the possibility of that normative practice of celibacy being dispensed? In my case.
Right.
And so it had to get permission from Rome, but that was granted. And a couple of years ago, he was ordained as a Catholic priest, married with several children. So there are, and there therefore could be, in South Dakota, married men who become priests.
Right. Most of the time in the U.S., the way I understand it, when you have a married priest, it has more to do with they came from the Anglican
or Lutheran usually. Now, in Father Drake's case, he was neither of those. He's more evangelical. But
often, if you're an Anglican priest, which has a lot of
similarities,
they may already be married.
Yep.
And then they become Catholic and can stay priests.
So one little kind of trivial, maybe a little. It's a little minutia, but in the East and the West, and this is true for deacons as well. If you are a married cleric, you're a priest or a deacon you have to be married first. So in the East and the West, if you're already ordained as a priest, you cannot get married unless you leave the priestly life. Right. So this possibility it's only for married men to become priests. Right. It's not for priests to get married. And that's true everywhere. Right. It's also the case that a married cleric whose wife dies, he cannot remarry.
Okay. That makes sense.
So a deacon, for instance, many Catholics are familiar with permanent deacons. A permanent deacon, most of them are married, not all, but most of them are married. If his wife dies before him, he cannot be married without being laicized. Right. He'd have to leave the clerical state.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's always been the case. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for to talk about male-only priesthood, but this has always been the case in the West of holding up celibacy. So, okay, but we could do away with it. Why don't we? Because in fact, the origins of priestly celibacy are ancient. And it seems, and there's an article I want to refer to and a book that I want to mention. It seems actually that the Eastern practice of the norm being married men who can get ordained, actually, well, it's not wrong because it's never been a doctrine. That is actually, it seems to be a deviation from the ancient apostolic practice.
Okay.
So there's evidence that in the ancient church, yes, married men could be ordained, but, so for our family-friendly audience here, once a man was ordained, the practice in the early centuries of the church is he and his wife could never have marital relations.
Oh.
Again.
So then that's probably better if you're not married, because that's going to be really rough.
Right, exactly. There's a book called The Apostolic Origins of Clerical Celibacy, or Priestly Celibacy. The Apostolic Origins of Priestly or Clerical Celibacy. I think it's out of print, but Ignatius Press published it by an Italian, Conchini, Conchini, is the author. But the gist of it is summarized. It's not cited, but the thing I want to point out is not unique to that book. There's an article in the National Catholic Register from a couple years ago called "The Gift of Priestly Celibacy." Again, the gift of priestly celibacy. So if you get online, you do an internet search for National Catholic Register, The Gift of Priestly Celibacy by Father Brian Mullady, Mullady, you'll find this article. And what Father Mullady talks about, I happen to have his article here in front of me, he refers to a 692 local church council. So not ecumenical council, but it was a local gathering, a local council in Constantinople. They decided to forego the requirement of perpetual continence. So the idea that married men could be ordained, but they had to remain continent.
Okay.
With in their marital life. So this local council decided to forego this requirement and allow married priests to have relations with their wives, though they sought to make a nod to the previous practice in several ways. First, a priest who had relations with his wife could not celebrate the Eucharist the day after, which put an end to daily Eucharist in the Eastern Church.
Ooh.
Also, since bishops have the fullness of the priestly character, only priests who are celibate could become bishops, which is contrary to the normal discipline in which religious should be bishops by way of exception, and goes on. So the point there is they said, but this is just too hard for us to ask couples to do, men and women to do. So we're going to relax this discipline of perpetual continence and allow married priests to have relations with their wives. But there were certain exceptions, recognizing what had been the practice beforehand.
Right. That makes sense.
So it had been that way, but the West said, our solution is we see the value of maintaining, like there's some connection between continence and offering the Eucharistic sacrifice. So we're going to go the other way and say that married men cannot be ordained.
Right. Okay.
And this is, and as Father Milady refers to, this has been, you still see this in the reality that bishops in the East and the West are always celibate.
Right, yeah.
Never married men ordained to the bishops.
Right.
So, any questions, just a minute or two before we transition?
I don't think so. I mean, from what I'm hearing here is that it could change in the future, but there's no talk of it and
we
nothing
didn't,
on the
to
table.
be honest, Renae, we didn't get into the reasons why. We gave just the tradition and the history of it, but there are all sorts of, and not just practical reasons. Right. Many priests will tell you that they see their bride as first and foremost the church, their flock. Now, again, you can have married men who are priests, so there is that, well, I can be married to a thing, but there are all sorts of reasons that can be, but the point is this has been an ancient tradition that has apostolic origins.
Right.
There are good reasons for it. We're just giving a little smattering of the history, but Father Milady's article might be a good one to start with.
Yeah.
All sorts of other things that we could point you to as well.
Yeah.
Ignition@sfcatholic.org would be a great email address to write in.
Yes. Okay.
So,
Next.
distinct from that. Okay, so we could solve the priest shortage crisis by ordaining married men and ordaining women. And this is where actually the discipline doctrine distinction is relevant because, in fact, on this question, it's not a matter of a discipline or a practice the church could change. This, in fact, is a doctrine.
Right.
That has always been held from the beginning with no exceptions among Catholic priests, the Catholic Church East and West.
Right.
That priesthood is reserved to men alone. Not denigrating the dignity of women, not saying that women are less than, but this in terms of different roles that we play both in nature but also in the church. The priesthood is for men alone, and this is also one. So it's a doctrine that can't change,
right? Because Jesus gave it to us.
So every doctrine comes from Jesus himself. Right. So I'm glad you said it. So the church does not. The Pope Francis, Pope Benedict JP2, going all the way back, they don't just, hey, what should our doctrines be? Let's spin the roulette wheel and see yes or no. No, yes on this, yes on that. No. All of the church's doctrines come from Jesus himself. So is there somewhere in Scripture where Jesus says priests will only be men? No, but there are a lot of teachings that come from Jesus where he doesn't explicitly speak them in the Gospels. We know that they're true because he showed them to us, or they're found in the apostolic tradition, either implicitly within Scripture or found more explicitly within tradition.
Right.
And this is one that goes back to Jesus. By the way, Jesus remained celibate.
Yes.
So the practice of celibacy, that one's not a doctrine. Peter, the first pope, so New Testament priest, Peter was married. We know that he'd been married. Right. St. Paul writes about that. But Jesus himself was celibate. So there's a model there. So for that practice of priestly celibacy, Jesus himself chose only men for the New Testament priesthood.
Right.
To the apostles, all of the apostles were men. All of the apostles chose as successors. So Paul choosing Timothy, only men. From the very beginning, the church has only ordained men to the priesthood. That's been the constant tradition, and with a capital T. it's important to remember from the very get-go that Jesus broke all sorts of societal cultural norms with regard to women. His greatest disciple was his mother, Mary, who he did not, or the holiest purely human being in history. Was Mary is Mary of Nazareth, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And Mary was not a priest. Mary Magdalene was the apostle to the quote unquote the apostle of the apostles. She was the first one that in scripture to bear witness to the resurrection. She went and told the apostles, he's risen from the dead, even when they laughed at her and mocked her. But she was not ordained to the priesthood. Jesus, for reasons, chose only men. So the church has always looked at it and said, and if you look at her language, so John Paul II, 1994, addressed this in one of his documents. The church can't. It's not that she chooses not to. The church can't ordain women to the priesthood because this is a doctrine that, like all doctrines, has its origins in Jesus himself. And its doctrines can't change because what's true in 2000 BC is true in 100 AD is true in 2022 AD. Right. So it can't change.
Is it possible, and I know I've heard this, I've actually seen some books and stuff about this. Is it possible that the men of the day just conveniently erased out the women's names and all of that, and then
there's no evidence for that there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Listen, and let's be clear. In the ancient Near East, it was common to have priestesses.
Right.
Like not Judaism.
Right.
But the religions around Israel, around the Holy Land, priestesses were very, very, that was a common reality. But Judaism, the Old Testament, always reserved the Old Testament priesthood to men alone. And in the New Testament, Jesus and his New Testament priesthood reserved priesthood to men alone. So, here's an important distinction that I want to make here. So, throughout the history of the church, it's been commonplace that the church has always taught certain things, but when people ask, why is this true? The church, because she has received these doctrines, these teachings from Jesus, she hasn't always had to articulate the reason. Usually, she hasn't had to try to understand the why for these teachings until somebody challenges it or questions it. So the why for Jesus's divinity. The church didn't really have to articulate arguments for Christ's divinity until the 4th century. 300 years after Jesus. The church didn't really have to get into this because it wasn't until the early 300s that there was a widespread challenge and question to the idea of Christ's divinity. The church has just always worshiped Jesus. Well, now along comes Arius, wait, no, but I don't really think he's got it. And the church had to go, okay, so we know this is true because it's been our constant teaching, but why is it true? Well, we've got to elaborate the teaching with an argument. So we're seeing this happen, quote unquote, in slow motion, real time in our day and age with male only priesthood. This has always been the case, but there are people over the last several decades who are challenging it. No, that's wrong, or at least questioning. Wait. Why? So we're sort of we are in the midst of, there's some early attempts, but we're still in the midst of answering the question why for the people in our time who are asking this question. There hasn't been a theological argument to explain the teaching because it was never challenged until the 20th century. So I think that's how it's always been. There's not an argument to explain, or there's not an explanation of the teaching until the teaching gets challenged.
I wonder if some of the supposed challenges or the things coming out of the German synod will force this issue to be defined more.
There's been work going on for decades in trying to explain what's true. So the teaching is true, but why? It seems unfair, unjust. It seems discriminatory. Well, that can't be true because again, if it's true, a truth from Jesus Christ can't be unfair or unjust or sinfully, at least, whatever. Like, it can't be immoral.
It's just that
wrong.
we don't understand
We
it.
just don't understand it. So there are, again, attempts that have been made to give an explanation. So I want to mention two books in particular. One is by a Dominican priest, Father Benedict Ashley. That's why I said Benedictine. Father Benedict Ashley, Justice in the Church, Gender and Participation.
Okay.
So this is a bit of a meatier read, but those who want to dive in, Justice in the Church. But another book by Sister Sarah Butler, The Catholic Priesthood and Women, A Guide to the Teaching of the Church. The Catholic Priesthood and Women, A Guide to the Teaching of the Church.
I think I've heard of that one. Is that the recent one?
It's about 16 years old at this point. But what I like about this one is Sister Butler, at one point, was an advocate for the ordination of women.
Interesting.
And by the late 80s, because of the witness of John Paul II and the esteem with which he held women and what he said about the dignity of women, sort of prompted her to question why have I thought that women should be ordained, and led her to actually change her mind and come to understand and embrace the church's teaching. So it's a guide to the teachings of the church. So she, in this book, is sort of working out some of the reasons to explain the why.
Right.
So again, her point is the church has always said this is true, but the reasons to answer the question, why is that true? They're in the midst of being worked out. And she gives some initial answers. We don't, in 15, 20 minutes, we don't have time to get into those. But this is a book that I would also highly recommend for folks. Yeah. So again, with all the teachings of the church, we're called to accept them as true because we believe they come from Jesus himself. But then we should ask why.
Yeah.
Not in a like, oh, come on.
Right.
But
I'm going to prove you wrong. Why?
Right. Yeah. But try to understand. And I would point to Father Ashley and especially Sister Butler's books as two places to start. So Renae, we've got like less than a minute left. Any thoughts?
Well, I think it's really helpful for people as they're getting it together with family, because these questions come up sometimes. They've come up to me, and I'm always like, well, because it's always been that way.
Right. And listen, I would be very open if we need to spend an episode or more unpacking either or both of these. That's something we could do in the future. But as you said, like especially with the set ablaze in our diocese and going into the holiday season, Thanksgiving and then Christmas, questions come up and folks might want to be able to point some things. So I know that we didn't get into like meaty arguments, but at least maybe today could serve as an appetizer for your Thanksgiving meal.
Sounds good.
Sounds good? Okay.
Yes.
Renae, thanks for being here today again.
Thanks.
Folks, that will wrap up this episode. Again, you can email us ignition@sfcatholic.org, ignition@sfcatholic.org, with questions about today's episode or ideas for future ones. Until next time, may God bless you.